One night I was a bit bored, so I decided to Google myself. I guess I shouldn't have been surprised when nothing turned up. It's not like I've done many exciting things with my life so far. All that popped up was a few school awards I'd won, and that was like it. I then decided to Google my parents. I put my dad's name in first, and I couldn't believe what came up. Dozens and dozens of images of a drag queen. But wait, that wasn't my dad. Yes, that guy had exactly the same name as my dad, but there was no way it was my dad. I clicked on the first link that appeared. I was intrigued now. Loud music started playing as soon as the site loaded. There were 4 drag queens featured on the page, and they all looked incredible. Like over-the-top glamorous with long sparkly eyelashes and excessive makeup and glitter. I was about to close the website when something caught my eye. There was a poster for an upcoming show with the drag queen who had the same name as my dad. I mean, my dad does have a pretty common name, so it's not that weird. But then I just couldn't stop laughing. My dad was the most serious businessman you could ever meet. I wanted to tell him what I'd found, but he'd probably turn his nose up at it and not even find it funny. He seriously lacked a sense of humor. I couldn't stop thinking about this drag queen with the same name as my dad. I found myself logging onto Instagram and searching for his name. Sure enough, there he was. It was odd because in a way he did remind me of my dad. There was just something about him. But at the same time, he was nothing like my dad. I started following him on Instagram, and if I'd been 21, I'd have totally gone to see the show. But alas, I was only 18, and it was too risky to try and sneak in. Before going to sleep, I deleted my Google search, just in case my dad somehow had access to my Google account. Like I said earlier, he's a serious guy, and a bit strict. And we don't exactly have the best father-daughter relationship. He's constantly on business trips in different states, and I swear I only see him on Sundays for lunch. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought how awesome it would be if my dad was even just a little bit like the drag queen who shared his name. Sure, it freaked me out a bit, but at least that guy looked like he had fun. My dad needed to loosen up a bit. The next day, the first thing I did was check my social media before heading off to school. I had clued myself up on drag queen terminology and was ready to impress my friends. I didn't tell them I'd followed that guy on Instagram, but throughout the day I kept watching his videos and he really made me laugh. His voice was so high-pitched. Obviously it was put on, but he was definitely a comedian in the making. The weeks went by and I found myself seriously becoming a fan of this guy. I'd do anything to see his show. It was coming up at the weekend, and the only way I could go would be if I was accompanied by someone over the age of 21. But who? I thought long and hard about it, and decided to ask my cousin Will. He was a student, and he was gay, and I figured that would be the kind of thing he'd be interested in. I called him, but unfortunately he couldn't make it, he said. Instead, though, he offered to give me his flatmate's ID. She was 22, and he said she looked similar to me, and that they wouldn't check it that carefully anyway. For the rest of the week, I was so nervous about it all. But by the time Saturday came around, I had the ID clutched tightly in my hand, and I'd worn a dress that made me look a bit older. I told my mom that I was going to watch movies at my friend's house, and that I'd be back later. Luckily, my dad was away on a trip, so I didn't need to explain myself to him. My hands were sweating so much when I arrived at the club that I thought the ID would slip right out of my palm. I stood in line and tried to act as confident as possible. It was bizarre to think that a few weeks ago, I wouldn't have been seen dead in a drag queen club, and yet here I was, doing everything I could to get inside. Oh, how things change. As the line snaked closer towards the front, I quickly applied a layer of lipstick, and then suddenly, I was at the front. I barely even made eye contact with the bouncer, and then the next moment, I was inside. Hang on, he hadn't even checked my ID. All that trouble for nothing. I bought my ticket and then walked through a massive red velvet curtain to find a seat. I wasn't about to risk buying a drink, so I just sat myself down and tried not to look awkward. Easier said than done when you're underage attending a drag show for the very first time in your life. I don't know what I'd expected, but everyone there looked quite normal. I think I'd gotten it into my head that the only people who attended stuff like this were drama queens. But there were even 2 old ladies sat in the front row. I guess I wouldn't stand out so much then. It took a little while for the show to start, but when it did, I was entranced. First up was a queen wearing a huge curly blue wig. He was hilarious and pranced around the stage telling jokes. I instantly liked him. He was so charming. I ran to the bathroom before the next performer, as I'd ended up buying a can of soda from the hostess. Without even realizing, I downed it and was now bursting. When I got back from the bathroom, I realized I'd missed the entrance of the drag queen with my dad's name. The whole reason I was even there in the first place. He was already out on stage, and he was wearing a long blonde wig and stilettos. I didn't want to interrupt his performance, so I waited at the back for an appropriate moment to head back to my seat. He was singing and I couldn't help but smile. He just had this incredible energy about him. Like, I wished he was my friend. He oozed confidence and he just seemed so comfortable up there. Plus, his voice was amazing. I couldn't take my eyes off of him. His first song came to an end, so I decided to take my chance and hurry back to my seat in the front row. Now I had a much closer view of him. And that's when it hit me. I felt winded, like someone had come up and punched me in the chest. It was him. It was my dad. I knew it as soon as I made eye contact with him. His whole demeanor changed, and he started stumbling over his words. I didn't know where to look or what to do. I wanted to run out of there and get fresh air, but I didn't want to make a scene. Somehow he managed to carry on with his performance, but as soon as he was done with that song, he rushed off stage. I could hear murmuring in the crowd as I ran out. I thought about going backstage and speaking to him about this, but I was in too much shock. Never in a billion years did I think my dad would do something like this. I mean, it didn't even make sense. He was supposed to be on a business trip. He was always on a business trip. And then it clicked. This whole time, had he been performing? And I just thought he was away on business? But why? He was living a double life, almost like he had two personalities, the boring dad and the glamorous drag queen. I had to find a way to talk to him. I sat outside on the curb for a while, trying to gather my thoughts. I couldn't go back inside. Did my mom know about this? How many people had he lied to? And seriously, why? I decided to call him. I nervously dialed his number and waited as it rang and rang. He didn't answer. I tried again, but still no answer. I knew he was ignoring my calls. He was probably angry that I'd snuck into a club, never mind the fact that I'd literally caught him in the act. This was a disaster. And yet, beneath my embarrassment, there was another unexpected feeling. Dare I say it, but I genuinely felt happy. My dad was actually way cooler and less miserable than I thought he was. Okay, so he was a drag queen, but hey, at least he wasn't as cold-hearted and boring as I'd originally thought. In fact, the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't even know my dad. What made him tick? How long had he been a drag queen for? And the big question, did my mom know about this? So many questions were running through my head. I knew I'd have to confront my dad sooner or later. I went home and my mom was already in bed, so I headed straight to my room. My phone beeped and I saw it was my dad. All it said was, "I'm sorry, I can explain. He didn't come home that night, or if he did, I was already fast asleep." The next morning, I heard him on the stairs and I stayed in bed, frozen. I felt so awkward. I knew he was embarrassed and I was too in a way, but I wanted to see him and talk about it. I finally plucked up the courage and headed towards my door. At that exact same moment, my dad was obviously about to knock on my door, and we completely banged into each other. He looked awful, like he hadn't slept a wink, and there was still a speck of glitter on his forehead. How had I not noticed this before, I thought? He asked if we could talk, and then he explained everything. He'd done a drag show back in college, just for fun, and he'd enjoyed it so much that he'd started doing it more often. He loved the thrill of being on stage, and that element of surprise that came with it. Just because he was a man, it didn't mean he couldn't enjoy wearing glitzy clothes and makeup. He was blushing the whole time that he told me this and apologized, and said he understood if I needed some time to think things through. I looked at him and smiled. "Dad, you don't need to apologize. I'm just surprised. Actually, I discovered this drag queen with the same name as you when I Googled you one day, but I had no idea it actually was you. I thought he was so cool, and there was just something about him that I liked so much. I was drawn to him, and now I know why. Because he is you. I mean, you are him." And then we laughed. He came over and sat next to me and gave me the biggest hug he'd ever given me in my life. As we were hugging, I asked him one more question. "Dad, does Mom know about this?" He threw his head back and let out a roaring laugh. "Of course she does, sweetie. She comes to a lot of my shows, and she even helps me with my makeup. She loves it." I was confused. "But doesn't that mean that you're gay?" "No, sweetie. Not all men who dress as drag queens are necessarily gay." I couldn't believe it. The more I got to know about this secret hobby of my dad's, the more I started to understand him. And it made me realize that up until that point, I hadn't even really tried to get to know him. Looking back, we can laugh about it all, and my dad was almost relieved that I discovered his secret in the way that I had. He told me he'd been waiting for me to get a bit older before he told me, in case I didn't approve. Well, he definitely didn't need to worry about that. I am now his biggest fan. What do you think of my story? Please share your comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel.